His retired war dog kept clawing one print drawer, until a hidden Vietnam secret exposed a powerful cover-up. A homeless Navy SEAL bought a $1 print shop. His dog found what was hidden in the type drawer. Ethan Cole arrived in Black Hollow, with nothing left but a broken truck, a haunted past, and an aging military dog named Ghost. But inside a burned-out print shop buried beneath the snowy Catskills, Ghost uncovered a hidden drawer tied to missing soldiers, government lies, and the father Ethan thought abandoned him forever. Comment 1 if you believe loyalty never dies, or 0 if you think some truths should stay buried. And tell us where you're watching from. Snow drifted sideways across Route 28 like handfuls of ash thrown by an invisible hand. The old pickup truck crawled through the Catskill Mountains with a grinding transmission and one headlight that flickered every few miles. The windshield heater barely worked. Frost crept along the inside corners of the glass while the tires hissed over black ice and slush. Behind the wheel, Ethan Cole stared into the storm with the rigid stillness of a man who had spent too many years scanning horizons for danger. 57 years old, 6 feet tall, leaner than he should have been, gray threaded through his dark beard and close-cropped hair. His nose had been broken twice. His left knee clicked every time he pressed the clutch. The thick scars on his hands looked pale against the steering wheel. In the passenger seat, Ghost lifted his head. The retired military shepherd's ears twitched toward the darkness ahead. "You hear something?" Ethan asked quietly. The dog didn't bark. Ghost almost never barked anymore. Instead, the shepherd stared through the windshield with focused amber eyes, body tense beneath his thick black and tan coat. Ethan glanced at the fuel gauge, almost empty again. He exhaled slowly through his nose and rubbed the ache spreading behind his right eye. Another night, another town, another place where nobody knew his name. The radio crackled with static before a local station faded in through the snowstorm. Temperatures expected to drop below 8 degrees tonight across Delaware County and the western Catskills. Ethan switched it off. Silence returned to the truck except for the groaning engine and the soft jingle of Ghost's old military collar. 3 months earlier, Ethan had still been sleeping in a rented trailer outside Scranton. Before that, a motel near Harrisburg. Before that, the back seat of the truck in Ohio. The divorce had burned through what remained of his savings. Medical bills had finished the rest. The security contractor company he'd tried to build after retirement collapsed when panic attacks started hitting him in crowded places. After Afghanistan, he couldn't stay inside buildings with no exits visible, couldn't sleep through fireworks, couldn't hear helicopters without tasting blood and sand in the back of his throat. And worst of all, he couldn't stop seeing the faces of the men who hadn't come home. Especially Travis Monroe, 24 years old, 2 daughters, dead because Ethan had made the call to enter a village road that should have been avoided. The military investigation cleared him. But clearance and forgiveness were 2 different things. The truck rolled past a faded green sign nearly buried under snow. Black Hollow, population 1842. Ghost let out a low sound in his throat. Not fear, awareness. Ethan slowed as the small mountain town emerged through the storm. Old brick storefronts, dark windows, a gas station glowing lonely beneath fluorescent lights, an abandoned textile mill crouched beside the frozen river like a dead animal under the snow. The whole town looked tired, not poor exactly, just forgotten. Ethan parked beside the gas pumps and stepped into the cold. The wind hit him immediately, sharp enough to steal breath from his lungs. Ghost jumped down beside him silently. The shepherd stayed close while Ethan filled the tank with the last of his cash. $23. That was all he had left after the fuel. Inside the station, a television above the coffee machine played muted weather coverage while an older woman stocked cigarette cartons behind the register. She looked up when Ethan entered, then at Ghost, then back at Ethan. Not fear. Assessment. Mountain towns taught people to assess strangers carefully. "You passing through?" she asked. Ethan rubbed warmth into his hands. "Maybe." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You military?" He gave a small nod. "Used to be." The woman glanced toward Ghost again. "That dog law enforcement. Retired military working dog." "Well," she said softly, "he still looks on duty." Ghost sat beside Ethan's leg without moving. Perfect posture, perfect discipline. The woman poured coffee into a paper cup and slid it across the counter. "On the house." Ethan hesitated. "Appreciate it." She leaned against the register. "You looking for work?" "Looking for a place to stop driving." That earned the smallest flicker of sympathy in her eyes. "There's an old building the county's been trying to get rid of." Ethan looked up. "What kind of building?" "Used to be a print shop. Down on Mercer Street." She shrugged. "Been empty since Reagan was president. Roof leaks. Pipes are shot. Whole place smells like wet paper." "Why would the county sell it cheap?" "Because nobody wants it." The woman pointed through the snowy window toward the lower part of town. "Condemned properties auction tomorrow morning at the courthouse. Most folks figure the building's cheaper to tear down than fix." Ethan drank the coffee slowly. Warm, bitter, good. "How cheap?" She gave a dry laugh. "Last notice said starting bids $1. Outside, wind rattled against the windows. Ghost suddenly turned his head toward the south side of town, ears forward. Still again. The woman noticed. "That dog sees ghosts or something?" Ethan looked at the shepherd. "Sometimes I think he does." The courthouse auction lasted less than 20 minutes. Nobody bid on the old print shop, not one person. The county clerk looked almost embarrassed, standing beneath fluorescent lights, while snow hammered the windows outside. "Property number 17, he announced. "Former Black Hollow Printing Company, Mercer Street. Structural deterioration present. Plumbing condemned. Electrical requires replacement." Silence. A few people shuffled papers. Someone coughed. Then a voice near the back muttered, "Hell, that place ought to be bulldozed." Small laughter followed. Ethan sat beside Ghost near the rear wall, wearing his old green canvas jacket and watching snow collect against the courthouse windows. The clerk sighed. "Opening bid remains $1. Ghost's ears twitched. Ethan raised his hand. The clerk blinked. "You're bidding?" "Yes." The room turned toward him. An older man in a hunting cap leaned sideways toward another. "That the drifter staying in the truck?" Ethan ignored them. The clerk cleared his throat awkwardly. "Any additional bids?" "Nothing." The gavel came down softly. "Sold just like that. $1. A dead print shop in a dying mountain town. The county handed him an iron key attached to a faded leather tag. Black Hollow Printing Co. 1891. The snow had thickened by the time Ethan and Ghost reached Mercer Street. The building stood halfway down the block between an abandoned pharmacy and a boarded-up bakery. 2 stories tall, brick. Narrow front windows covered from inside with yellowed newspaper. The faded, painted sign above the entrance barely remained visible beneath decades of weather. Black Hollow Printing. The letters looked like ghosts fading back into the wall. Ethan stood in the snow holding the key. Ghost pressed close beside him. For a moment, neither moved. Then Ethan unlocked the door. The hinges groaned open into darkness. Cold air drifted out, carrying the smell of dust, old paper, machine oil, and something deeper, like time itself had been sealed inside. Ethan stepped in carefully. Floorboards creaked beneath his boots. The flashlight beam swept across the room. A massive cast-iron printing press stood at the center, like an ancient machine abandoned after war. Wooden shelves lined the walls. Dust covered everything in soft gray layers. Near the back of the room stood a long wall of wooden-type drawers, stretching almost to the ceiling. Hundreds of them, small brass handles, tiny faded labels. The beam moved across them slowly. And beside him, Ghost froze. The dog's body locked instantly. Every muscle tightened. Ethan stopped walking. Ghost stared toward the far right corner of the cabinet wall, one specific drawer near the bottom. The shepherd's ears rose sharply. Then came the sound. Not a bark, not a growl, a low warning rumbled deep in Ghost's chest. Ethan felt the hairs rise along his arms. "What is it, boy?" Ghost took 3 slow steps forward, then stopped directly in front of the drawer, staring, unmoving. Snow hissed against the dark windows outside. The building groaned softly in the wind. And in the cold silence of the abandoned print shop, Ethan Cole suddenly realized 2 things at the exact same moment. The first was that Ghost had never reacted this way without reason. And the second was that for the first time in a very long time, Ethan no longer felt alone. The feeling unsettled him almost as much as the dog's behavior. Ghost remained frozen in front of the bottom right drawer, amber eyes fixed on it with absolute concentration. Dust floated through the flashlight beam between them while the old building creaked softly around their bodies. Ethan moved closer. "What do you smell?" Ghost lowered his head slightly. Another low rumble vibrated through the shepherd's chest. Not aggression. Warning. Ethan crouched beside the cabinet and brushed his fingers across the drawer handle. Dust coated his skin instantly. The brass label holder was tarnished black with age, but beneath the grime he could still make out faded lettering. 12 PT. Caslin, he frowned. The words stirred something buried deep in memory, his father's voice. Warm, grease-stained hands guiding his own across wooden trays filled with metal letters. "That's Caslin, son. Good newspaper face. Easy on tired eyes." The memory hit hard enough to tighten Ethan's throat. He pulled his hand away from the drawer and stood sulkily. "Not tonight," he murmured. Ghost finally looked up at him. The shepherd obeyed instantly when Ethan gestured toward the center of the room. But even while walking away, the dog kept glancing back at the cabinet wall. Outside, the storm thickened. Snow hammered against the windows while Ethan unpacked the few things he still owned from the truck. 1 duffel bag, 2 blankets, a camp stove, a battered metal thermos, Ghost's medical kit, a small framed photograph wrapped carefully in an old sweatshirt. Ethan set the photograph face down beside the press without looking at it. Some nights he could look at old pictures. Some nights he couldn't. Tonight was not one of those nights. The print shop had no working electricity except a single hanging bulb near the front counter that flickered weakly whenever the wind hit the building hard enough. The place smelled frozen. Old paper, wet wood, iron, ink, not unpleasant, just abandoned. Ethan swept a section of floor beside the massive printing press and spread his army blankets there. Ghost circled the area twice before lying down, facing the front door automatically. Military training older than instinct now. Always face the entrance. Always protect the handler. Ethan sat against the cast iron press and rubbed both hands over his face. Silence settled around them. Not city silence, not highway silence, mountain silence. The kind that pressed against windows and filled empty buildings like deep water. For a while, Ethan simply listened to Ghost breathing. Then his eyes drifted upward toward the enormous machine looming beside him. Even covered in dust, the old Chandler and Price press possessed a strange dignity. Its flywheel stood taller than Ethan's chest. Heavy gears rested frozen beneath decades of neglect. Rust covered the treadle and feed board in reddish-brown streaks. But underneath all of it, craftsmanship remained. Someone had built this machine to survive generations. The thought stayed with him as exhaustion finally pulled him toward sleep. And then Afghanistan returned. Gunfire cracked through darkness, smoke, shouting. A village road exploding beneath armored tires. Ethan jerked awake with his pulse hammering violently against his ribs. For one terrible second, he reached for a rifle that wasn't there anymore. Ghost was already standing over him, alert, protective. The shepherd pressed against Ethan's shoulder until the shaking passed. Snow hissed outside the windows. The old print shop stood silent around them. Not Afghanistan. Not Kandahar. Not war. Ethan closed his eyes and rested one hand against Ghost's neck. "I'm all right." Ghost stayed awake anyway, watching the door, watching the room, watching the darkness. Morning arrived gray and brittle. The storm had buried Mercer Street beneath nearly a foot of fresh snow. The town moved slowly beneath low clouds while smoke curled from chimneys across Black Hollow. Ethan stepped outside holding a broom he'd found in the back room and began clearing the sidewalk in front of the print shop. People noticed. Small towns always noticed. An old man walking a bloodhound paused across the street to stare openly. A woman carrying groceries slowed near the corner. Two teenagers laughed while pointing at the faded sign overhead. "Guy actually bought that dump." Ghost remained beside the doorway, silently observing everyone. The dog's size alone discouraged conversation. By noon, Ethan had uncovered most of the front windows from inside. Weak winter light spilled across the shop floor, revealing more details hidden by darkness the night before. Long wooden work tables, shelves of ancient ink tins, stacks of yellowed newspapers tied with string, hundreds upon hundreds of type drawers, and everywhere, dust, decades of it. Ethan found an old push broom and began cleaning methodically. Military habits took over quickly, one section at a time. Clear, organize, reassess. Ghost followed him room by room. The back office still contained ledgers stacked neatly beside a rusted adding machine. A calendar from 1983 hung crooked on one wall above a desk layered in mouse droppings. November. The shop must have closed near winter. Ethan imagined someone locking the front door, believing they'd return Monday morning, and then never coming back. The thought felt strangely familiar. Near sunset, a dark green pickup truck rolled slowly to the curb outside. A heavy-set man climbed out wearing a camouflage jacket and expensive leather boots. Curtis Vale, though Ethan didn't know his name yet. The man studied the building with open irritation before walking toward the entrance. Ghost stood immediately. The dog's posture changed, not hostile, assessing. Curtis stopped when he saw the shepherd. "That thing bite?" "Only when necessary," Ethan answered calmly. Curtis snorted. "You the veteran bought this place?" "Yes." The man glanced around the shop with visible disgust. "County should bulldozed it years ago." Ethan said nothing. Curtis shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. "You know this whole block's dead, right? Nobody's opening businesses down here." "I'm not opening a business." "Then what are you doing?" Ethan looked around the room slowly, trying to stop moving. Something flickered across Curtis Vale's face. Not sympathy, calculation. "You planning on staying long?" "Don't know yet." Curtis stared toward the huge press in the center of the room. "You got any idea what fixing this place costs?" "No." "Well," Curtis said dryly, "better figure it out before winter finishes the job." He turned toward the door, then paused. "Name's Curtis Vale. I own the storage lots north of town." Ethan nodded once. Curtis looked at Ghost again. "That dog keeps staring at me." "Dogs notice things." Curtis gave a humorless chuckle. "Yeah, sometimes they do." Then he left. Ghost continued watching through the front window, long after the truck disappeared into falling snow. That evening, Ethan discovered the old boiler still contained traces of fuel oil. Against all odds, after 2 hours of work and several bruised knuckles, he managed to coax weak heat through ancient pipes that rattled like bones inside the walls. The sound transformed the building immediately. The shop no longer felt dead, just sleeping. Ethan sat near the press, eating canned stew warmed over the camp stove while Ghost rested nearby. For the first time in months, Ethan was indoors, without feeling trapped. No motel walls pressing inward, no shelter noise, no crowded parking lots, just space, silence, breathing room. His eyes drifted again toward the wall of typed drawers. And there, Ghost was watching the same cabinet, again. The shepherd rose slowly and walked toward it. One drawer, Bottom right corner, always the same one. Ethan stood and followed. This time he noticed something else. The wood around that specific drawer looked smoother than the others. Handled more often, maybe. Or more recently. He reached toward it again. Ghost immediately stiffened. Ethan stopped. What is it? The dog stepped between Ethan and the cabinet. Protective. Not fearful. Protective. That unsettled Ethan more than barking would have. SEAL teams learn to trust behavior changes, especially from military dogs. Ghost had detected explosives twice during deployment before human eyes ever spotted danger. Once he'd saved Ethan's entire unit by refusing to enter a roadside compound moments before a secondary device detonated inside. Ghost did not react randomly, ever. The old building groaned softly as wind moved through the mountains outside. Snow tapped against the windows, and somewhere deep inside the walls, Ethan thought he heard the faint sound of metal shifting. He turned quickly. Nothing. Only darkness stretching toward the back hallway. Still, something about the shop had changed. The room no longer felt abandoned. It felt aware. Ghost moved closer beside him. The shepherd's ears rose toward the ceiling, as if listening to something Ethan couldn't hear. Then slowly, very slowly, Ghost lowered himself beside the mysterious drawer and rested his head directly against the wood, guarding it. Like whatever waited inside already mattered. Ethan stood motionless in the dim print shop while the old boiler pipes knocked softly inside the walls. Ghost never guarded objects, people, doors, perimeters, vehicles, not drawers. Yet the retired military shepherd remained stretched across the floor in front of the cabinet, as if protecting something hidden beneath the wood. Ethan looked toward the dark hallway again. Nothing there, still, the feeling remained. The strange sensation that the abandoned print shop was not entirely empty. He finally crouched beside Ghost and scratched gently behind the dog's ears. We'll figure it out tomorrow. Ghost's eyes stayed fixed on the drawer, but eventually the shepherd rose and followed Ethan back toward the blankets beside the press. Outside, snow drifted quietly across Mercer Street beneath weak orange streetlights. Inside, the old building breathed and settled around them through the long mountain night. And sometime after midnight, Ghost woke him again, not barking, just staring. Ethan opened his eyes instantly. Years of military conditioning still lived inside his nervous system like buried wire. The dog stood rigid beside the front window, watching the street. Ethan rose silently and moved beside him. A truck sat idling across from the print shop, headlights off, dark shape beneath falling snow. Someone inside watching the building. Ethan narrowed his eyes. The truck remained there for almost a minute, then slowly drove away toward the northern end of town. Ghost continued staring long after the taillights disappeared. Easy, Ethan murmured. But the dog did not relax. Morning arrived under heavy gray skies. The snowstorm had passed, leaving Black Hollow buried beneath glittering drifts that reflected pale winter sunlight across the valley. Smoke curled from chimneys, while church bells echoed faintly somewhere deeper in town. Ethan spent the morning cleaning broken glass from the front office. Ghost followed him constantly, too constantly. The shepherd usually rested while Ethan worked. Now he paced room to room like a soldier patrolling hostile ground. At noon, Ethan discovered an old cast-iron coffee pot beneath the front counter and managed to clean enough rust from it to boil water over the camp stove. The smell of coffee transformed the room instantly, warmer, human again. He was pouring a second cup when the front door opened. Ghost reacted before Ethan even turned. The shepherd moved between Ethan and the entrance in one smooth, silent motion. A woman stood framed in the doorway, holding a cardboard tray with 2 steaming cups and a brown paper bag tucked beneath her arm. She looked to be in her early 60s, silver hair tucked beneath a wool cap, long green coat dusted with snow, kind eyes but tired ones. The woman stopped immediately when she saw Ghost. "Oh my, he won't hurt you," Ethan said calmly. Ghost remained still, watching. The woman slowly extended one gloved hand. "What's his name?" "Ghost." The dog sniffed once, then stepped aside. That seemed to surprise her. "Well," she said softly, "he's got better manners than most men in this town." Ethan almost smiled. Almost. She crossed the room carefully, looking around the print shop with visible emotion. "I haven't been inside this building since 1979. You knew the place. My father used to bring me here when I was little." She set the coffee tray down gently. "I'm Clara Bennett. Ethan Cole." She nodded toward the huge press in the center of the room. Most folks figured they'd haul that machine out for scrap years ago. Ethan glanced at it. Still solid. "You know printing presses? My father repaired newspaper equipment in Vermont." Clara looked at him more carefully after that, noticing details now. The scars, the posture, the tiredness behind his eyes. "Military?" she asked quietly. "SEAL teams. Retired?" Ethan hesitated. "Something like that." She didn't press further. Instead, she handed him one of the coffee cups. "There's a diner down the block. I brought breakfast before Martha sold everything to the hunters." Inside the paper bag were eggs, toast, and thick bacon wrapped in foil. Ethan stared at it for a second too long. Clara noticed. "You should eat while it's hot." He cleared his throat. "Thank you." Ghost finally relaxed enough to lie beside the press again, while Clara wandered slowly through the building. Her fingers brushed lightly across one of the type cabinets. "My grandfather worked here during summers," she said softly, "back when Black Hollow still had 2 newspapers and a textile mill running day and night." Ethan ate quietly while listening. "There used to be life on this street," Clara continued. "You could hear the presses from half a block away. My mother said the sound was comforting, like the town had a heartbeat." She stopped near the front window. Then the mill closed. Young people left. Businesses followed. And the print shop? "Nobody prints local papers anymore." Her voice carried no bitterness, only fact. Ghost suddenly lifted his head. The shepherd stared toward the back type cabinets again. Clara noticed immediately. "What's wrong with him?" "He keeps watching one drawer." "Which one?" Ethan pointed toward the bottom right cabinet. Clara walked over carefully. The moment she approached, Ghost stood, alert again, not aggressive, protective. Clara frowned slightly. "That's strange. You ever seen him react like this before?" Ethan asked. "No." She crouched slowly beside the cabinet. "Dogs usually hated this building back when it was open. Too much machine noise." Ghost moved beside her and stared directly at the drawer again. Clara leaned closer. "Bottom right case." Her expression shifted faintly. "What?" "I don't know." She rubbed dust from the brass label holder. "Something about it feels familiar." Ethan watched her carefully. "You remember what was kept there? Type, maybe. Or invoices." She shook her head slowly. "It's been 40 years. The dog's behavior unsettled her, though. That much Ethan could see." Before she left, Clara paused beside the front door. "People in town are talking about you already." "That's so. Black Hollow doesn't get strangers often." She smiled faintly. "Especially homeless veterans buying condemned buildings for $1. I'm not looking for trouble." "That may not matter." She hesitated. "Curtis Vale's been trying to buy this property for years." Ethan remembered the man from yesterday. Storage lot owner, yes. Curtis owns half the empty buildings north of Main Street now. Clara lowered her voice slightly. "He doesn't like obstacles." Ghost stood beside Ethan, watching her carefully. Clara glanced down at the shepherd. "That dog trusts you completely. He saved my life twice. And I think," she said softly, "you probably saved his." After she left, silence returned to the print shop. But it no longer felt hollow. The smell of coffee lingered in the air. Human voices had touched the room again. Ghost wandered back toward the type cabinets. The same drawer, always the same one. That afternoon, Ethan explored the upstairs level for the first time. The staircase groaned beneath his boots, while Ghost climbed ahead of him silently. The second floor had once housed offices and layout rooms. Broken desks leaned beneath cracked windows. Filing cabinets stood rusted shut against peeling walls. But one room stopped Ethan cold. A narrow office overlooking Mercer Street. And inside, a row of old newspaper photographs pinned crookedly above a desk. Black Hollow football teams, town parades, military memorials. One photograph showed a group of young men in Vietnam-era uniforms standing beside crates marked print material. Ethan stepped closer. The image was blurry from age. But one face looked painfully familiar. Before he could study it longer, Ghost growled sharply downstairs. Instantly alert, Ethan moved. The sound wasn't fear, it was warning. He descended fast. Ghost stood at the front window again, watching. Outside, Sheriff Dean Mercer's patrol's SUV rolled slowly toward the curb. The sheriff climbed out wearing a brown winter coat and heavy boots. Mid-60s, broad shoulders. Military posture. Ghost did not bark, which told Ethan enough already. Mercer entered carefully. His eyes scanned the room automatically the way veterans did when entering unfamiliar spaces. Then they landed on Ghost. Belgian Malinois, German Shepherd mix. Military, retired. The sheriff nodded slowly. So are you. Not a question. Ethan crossed his arms. What can I do for you, Sheriff? Mercer removed his gloves. Town council asked me to check on the new owner. I paid legally. I know. The sheriff studied the old press. Then the cabinets. Then Ethan himself. You sleep in here? For now. Mercer sighed quietly through his nose. Building's colder than a coffin at night. I've slept worse places. Something passed briefly across the sheriff's face. Recognition, maybe. Veterans always recognize certain sentences. Ghost finally sat near Ethan's boots. Relaxed. That seemed to settle Mercer slightly. I heard Curtis Vale's already bothering you. He stopped by. He'll stop by again. The sheriff moved closer to the type cabinets. You know what this place used to be? Print shop. More than that. Mercer looked around carefully. Back in the 70s, folks said reporters met here after hours. Vietnam protests, veteran groups, small-town politics. Ethan frowned slightly. What kind of politics? Mercer shrugged. Depends who's telling the story. The sheriff's eyes drifted toward the bottom right cabinet, and Ghost immediately stood again. Watching him now, Mercer noticed. That dog doesn't like something in here. No. The sheriff stared toward the drawer for a long moment, then quietly said, Funny thing is, neither do I. Outside, wind moved softly through the snow-covered streets of Black Hollow, and deep inside the old print shop, something hidden waited patiently in the dark. The feeling followed Ethan long after Sheriff Mercer left that evening. Snow fell steadily outside the front windows, while the old patrol SUV disappeared down Mercer Street, its taillights fading into the white haze, swallowing Black Hollow one block at a time. Ghost remained standing beside the type cabinet, watching the same drawer, always the same drawer. Ethan stared at it from across the room, while heating canned chili over the camp stove. What do you know that I don't? Ghost's ears twitched slightly at the sound of his voice, but the shepherd never looked away from the cabinet. The boiler pipes knocked softly overhead. Wind moved against the brick walls. The old print shop breathed around them like a sleeping animal. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt something dangerous beginning to return inside him. Curiosity. Most men would have called it harmless, but curiosity had gotten people killed in war. Questions led to roads. Roads led to traps. Traps led to funerals. Ethan knew better than most men how expensive unanswered questions could become. Still, the drawer stayed in his mind long after midnight. He finally fell asleep, sitting upright beside the press, with Ghost lying across his boots. And once again, the dreams came. Bright desert sunlight, rotors thundering overhead, the metallic smell of blood inside armored steel. Travis Monroe screaming for a medic while smoke climbed into a white Afghan sky. Ethan woke violently with his fists clenched. The old press stood over him in darkness. Not Afghanistan, not war, the print shop. Ghost immediately pressed his head against Ethan's chest, grounding him, breathing slow, steady. The shepherd had learned long ago how to pull Ethan back from nightmares. Sometimes before Ethan even realized he was having one. Ethan rested his forehead briefly against the dog's neck. "You're still working overtime, huh?" Ghost gave a low huff through his nose. Outside, dawn slowly touched the mountains. The next morning, Ethan began restoring the press. Not because he planned to reopen the business, not yet. Mostly because his hands needed something to do. Stillness was dangerous for men like him. Stillness left room for memory. He stripped off his jacket and studied the enormous Chandler and Price machine carefully beneath pale winter light. The flywheel was seized solid, rollers cracked, gears layered in ancient grease and rust. But beneath all that, the machine remained intact. Built properly, built to last. Ethan ran his fingers across the cast-iron frame, stamped near the base. Older than everyone left in Black Hollow. Maybe older than the town itself. He found old oil cans in the back room and spent nearly an hour cleaning frozen grit from the flywheel bearings while Ghost watched from nearby. The work settled him, not emotionally, physically. There was comfort in mechanical problems. Machines broke for reasons. Machines could be repaired. People were harder. By noon, sweat dampened the back of Ethan's gray thermal shirt despite the cold building. His injured knee ached sharply every time he crouched beside the press, but he ignored it. Pain was information, nothing more. Ghost suddenly stood and walked toward the front windows. A moment later, the bell above the entrance door jingled softly. Clara Bennett stepped inside carrying a cardboard box. "Smells better in here today," she said. Ethan wiped grease from his hands with a rag, trying to wake the place up. Her eyes moved toward the press. "You're actually fixing it." "Trying." Clara crossed slowly through the shop, boots creaking against old floorboards. Ghost greeted her this time with a single tail thump before returning to his position near the mysterious drawer. Clara noticed immediately. "He's still doing that?" "Every day." She studied the shepherd carefully. "That's not normal behavior." "No." Ethan removed another rusted panel from the machine. "You know anything about the previous owners?" Clara sat on a stool beside the work table. "Not much. The last printer died sometime in the 80s, I think." "No family?" "Not around here." She paused. "Why?" Ethan glanced toward the cabinet wall. "Because my dog acts like somebody's still protecting something." The words hung quietly between them. Clara opened the cardboard box carefully. Inside were books, old printing manuals, type catalogs, repair guides. "I found these in the library basement," she said. "Thought they might help." Ethan picked up one of the manuals. Letterpress, Operation and Maintenance, 1954 edition. He flipped through yellowed pages filled with diagrams of presses nearly identical to the one beside him. Something tightened unexpectedly in his chest. His father had owned books like these. Nathan Cole. Tall, patient, ink permanently stained into the creases of his fingers. Before the drinking got bad. Before the disappearance. Before Ethan stopped believing fathers stayed. "You all right?" Clara asked softly. Ethan realized he'd gone still. "Yeah," but his voice sounded far away even to himself. Clara watched him quietly for a moment. "You know," she said carefully, "Sheriff Mercer told me you were in Afghanistan." Ethan kept his eyes on the machine. "Long time ago, my husband served in Iraq." She lowered her voice slightly. "Some things never really leave, do they?" The room fell silent. Ghost shifted near the cabinet. Outside, snow slid from rooftops into the street. Finally, Ethan spoke. "You ever notice how people thank veterans mostly because they're uncomfortable?" Clara blinked slightly. "What do you mean?" "They don't know what else to say." Ethan tightened a bolt slowly. So they say, thank you, hoping it ends the conversation. Clara considered that, then quietly answered, maybe some people are just trying to tell you they're glad you survived. That hit harder than Ethan expected. He looked away. The old print shop suddenly felt warmer than before, not because of the boiler, because another human being was sitting inside it. Listening, Ghost rose abruptly, instantly alert. The shepherds stared toward the front windows again. A dark pickup truck rolled slowly past the building. Curtis Vale, watching. The truck continued another 20 yards before disappearing around the corner. Clara sighed softly. He's worried. About what, you staying? Ethan frowned. This building's worthless. Not the land underneath it. She stood and walked toward the front counter. Curtis buys abandoned properties cheap. Half the empty buildings near the river belong to him now. Why care about one old print shop? Clara glanced toward the cabinet wall. Maybe because he thinks there's something here. The words settled heavily into the room. Ghost returned slowly to the drawer and sat beside it again. Guarding, always guarding. That evening, Ethan finally loosened the flywheel. The moment happened suddenly. 1 second, the wheel refused to move. The next, it shifted with a deep metallic groan echoing through the building. Ghost immediately stood. Clara smiled in surprise. There it is. Ethan pushed again carefully. The enormous wheel turned another inch, then another. Dust drifted down from overhead beams while frozen gears slowly awakened for the first time in decades. The sound filled the print shop, heavy, mechanical, alive. And something happened to Ethan the moment the machine moved. Not happiness exactly, but purpose. Tiny, fragile, still real. The feeling startled him more than anything else had since arriving in Black Hollow. For years his life had narrowed into survival. Wake up, keep moving, avoid memories, sleep badly, repeat. Now suddenly, there was a task in front of him, something broken waiting to be repaired. Ghost walked quietly to Ethan's side and leaned against his leg while the flywheel completed another slow rotation. Clara watched both of them carefully. You know, she said softly, this place hasn't sounded alive in a very long time. Ethan rested one hand on the press. Neither had he. Night settled early across the mountains. Clara left before the roads iced over completely, promising to return with more repair manuals from the library archives. Ethan locked the front door after her and stood listening to the silence. Different silence now. The kind that follows work. Ghost wandered back toward the cabinet wall once more. The shepherd lowered himself beside the drawer again, head resting against the wood, watching, waiting. Ethan crossed the room slowly. This time he crouched beside the cabinet long enough to study it carefully. The wood grain around the bottom right drawer looked worn smoother than the others, almost polished. And beneath the dust, tiny scratches surrounded the brass screws near the frame, as though someone had removed the drawer many times over the years. Ghost stared directly at him. The dog knew. Ethan could feel it now with absolute certainty. Whatever waited inside that cabinet, Ghost had already decided it mattered. And somewhere deep in Ethan's bones, the old instincts that once kept him alive overseas whispered something he had not felt in years. Mission. Ethan stayed crouched beside the cabinet long after midnight, studying the bottom right drawer while Ghost sat beside him like a silent sentry. The old print shop had gone completely quiet. Even the boiler pipes had stopped knocking. Only the wind remained, soft against the windows, steady against the mountains. Ethan ran his thumb slowly across the drawer's edge again. Smooth, too smooth. The surrounding wood carried decades of scratches and wear, but this one section looked different. Handled more often, maintained longer. Ghost leaned closer. The shepherd's nose brushed lightly against the lower corner. Then Ghost looked directly at Ethan. Waiting. Ethan exhaled slowly. All right. He gripped the brass handle carefully and pulled. The drawer slid open with a dry wooden rasp. Inside sat rows of dusty metal type blocks arranged neatly in tiny compartments. Letters, numbers, punctuation. The smell rising from the drawer hit Ethan unexpectedly. Lead, ink, machine oil. Memory. For a split second, he was 8 years old again, standing beside his father in a tiny Vermont newspaper shop, while snow fell outside and printing presses thundered through the walls. Nathan Cole's hands moved across type trays with astonishing speed, everything backward, everything reversed. "You don't read the letters," his father had once told him softly. "You read the shape of the words." Ethan swallowed hard and blinked the memory away. Ghost nudged the bottom of the drawer insistently. Not the type. Beneath it. Ethan lifted several compartments carefully from the tray. Dust drifted through the flashlight beam. The bottom panel looked normal at first glance. Then he saw it, tiny brass screws, almost invisible beneath decades of grime. His pulse slowed automatically. Combat calm. Focus narrowing. He looked toward Ghost. The shepherd remained completely still now, watching Ethan's hands. "You knew," Ethan whispered. Ghost's ears twitched. Ethan stood slowly and crossed the room toward the workbench. After several minutes searching through old rusted tools, he found a flathead screwdriver buried beneath a stack of stained invoices. When he returned to the drawer, something deep inside him already knew his life was about to change. He removed the first screw carefully, then the second, then the third. The fourth resisted badly from corrosion, but eventually gave way with a sharp metallic crack. Ghost immediately stood, alert. Ethan lifted the thin wooden panel slowly. A hidden compartment waited beneath it. His breath caught. Inside the shallow cavity rested several objects wrapped carefully in oilcloth and yellowed newspaper. Untouched for decades, Ghost stepped closer but did not interfere. Protecting, watching. Ethan removed the first bundle carefully. Military dog tags, cold against his palm. He turned them over beneath the flashlight. Nathan Cole, Opos, Protestant. For a moment the room tilted around him. His father's name, here. Inside a hidden drawer in a forgotten print shop nearly 300 miles from Vermont. Ethan sat back slowly against the cabinet. Ghost pressed immediately against his shoulder. The old ache returned then, the one buried beneath years of deployments and survival and anger. Nathan Cole had vanished when Ethan was 12 years old. One morning he simply never came home. No explanation, no body, no goodbye. His mother spent years calling hospitals and police stations before finally accepting the official assumption that Nathan had abandoned the family. Ethan had accepted it too, or at least tried to. Now his father's dog tag sat cold in his hand, inside an abandoned mountain print shop. Nothing about that made sense. His fingers shook slightly as he reached for the second bundle. Stacks of old bills, hundreds, rubber banded together and yellow with age. The third package contained photographs, black and white mostly. Men beside printing presses. Military uniforms, boxes labeled press material, and then one image stopped Ethan cold. A younger Nathan Cole stood beside a German Shepherd military dog in front of the very same print shop. The faded sign overhead still read black hollow printing. Nathan looked younger than Ethan remembered him, stronger, smiling slightly beneath a heavy winter coat. Beside him stood another man holding newspapers under one arm. Tall, thin, wire-rimmed glasses. The back of the photograph carried handwritten words, faded, nearly invisible with age. Samuel Whitaker, December 1971. Ghost let out a low sound deep in his throat. Ethan stared at the photograph for a long time. His father had been here, not once, repeatedly. The final object remained wrapped separately beneath the others. A leather journal tied with string. Ethan untied it carefully. The cover creaked softly as he opened it. Inside were pages filled with neat handwritten entries, dates, names, locations. Some entries discussed printing schedules. Others mentioned newspaper shipments. Then Ethan reached a page that changed the air in the room completely. November 18, 1971, Nathan says they're still watching the roads outside Albany. We moved the photographs into the drawer tonight. If anything happens to me before publication, somebody must eventually finish this story. Ethan felt cold spread slowly through his chest. Not mountain cold, something deeper. Ghost suddenly turned toward the front windows. Instant alert. The shepherd growled low. Headlights moved slowly past the building outside. Ethan snapped the journal shut immediately and killed the flashlight. Darkness swallowed the room. The truck outside slowed, stopped. Ghost positioned himself silently between Ethan and the windows. No barking, professional silence. Ethan lowered himself carefully beside the cabinet and watched through a crack in the paper-covered glass. Curtis Vale's truck, idling, watching the building. Snow drifted through the headlights while the engine rumbled softly in the darkness. Ethan's heartbeat slowed into old operational rhythm. Assess, observe, wait. The truck remained there nearly 2 full minutes, then finally rolled away. Ghost continued growling long after the sound faded. Ethan relit the flashlight slowly. The print shop suddenly felt much smaller than before, and much more dangerous. He looked again at the journal, at his father's dog tags. At the hidden compartment, somebody had gone to enormous trouble protecting. Questions crashed through his mind all at once. Why had Nathan Cole been here? Who was Samuel Whitaker? What story had they hidden? And why did Curtis Vale keep watching the building? Ghost returned beside Ethan and lowered himself quietly to the floor again, guarding the open drawer now. The shepherd's paws rested directly beside Nathan Cole's dog tags. Ethan looked at him carefully. "You smelled this all along?" Ghost blinked slowly. The old seal inside Ethan understood something then that the exhausted homeless drifter had not yet accepted. This was no accident, not the shop, not the drawer, not the dog's behavior. Some invisible thread had been pulling him toward Black Hollow long before he saw the town sign buried in snow. Outside, church bells rang faintly across the sleeping valley. Midnight. Ethan gathered the journal and photographs carefully and carried them toward the work table beside the press. Ghost stayed glued to his side. The leather pages crackled softly as Ethan continued reading beneath lantern light. Entry after entry described meetings, printing schedules, military names, travel between New York and Washington. Then finally, another line stopped him cold. Nathan believes the soldiers were left behind intentionally. If these documents become public, powerful men will fall. Ethan stared at the sentence. A pressure built slowly behind his ribs. Afghanistan returned suddenly, not visually, emotionally. The unbearable weight of men lost because somebody higher up had made decisions from safe rooms thousands of miles away. Ghost rested his head against Ethan's knee, grounding him again. Ethan closed the journal slowly. The old press loomed beside him in shadow. The type cabinets stretched along the walls like silent witnesses. And somewhere beneath the grief and confusion and exhaustion, another feeling emerged. Not hope, not yet purpose. The kind men followed into impossible places. Outside, snow continued falling over Black Hollow. And inside the old print shop, the past had finally opened its eyes. Ethan barely slept. The leather journal remained open beside the lantern, while snowlight reflected dimly through the front windows of the shop. Ghost stayed awake most of the night, stretched beside the work table, with his ears constantly twitching toward the street outside. Every hour or so, Ethan found himself staring again at his father's dog tags lying beside the journal. Nathan Cole, not a memory anymore, not a ghost, evidence, real enough to hold in his hands. The realization unsettled him deeply. For 45 years, Ethan had carried a very specific kind of anger, the kind children build carefully when somebody disappears without explanation. His mother used to sit at the kitchen table in Vermont long after midnight, pretending to read while waiting for headlights that never came up the driveway. At first, she believed Nathan had gotten hurt. Then she believed he'd gotten lost. Eventually, she believed he'd chosen not to return. That final version had wounded Ethan worst of all. Because abandoned children always assume they weren't worth staying for. Now, sitting inside the freezing print shop beneath lantern light, Ethan slowly realized his father may never have had the chance to come home at all. The thought hollowed something inside him. Ghost rose suddenly near dawn and walked to the front window, watching again. Ethan moved beside him quietly. A figure stood across Mercer Street beneath the pale morning snow. Not Curtis Vale this time, Sheriff Dean Mercer. The older man stood with both hands buried in his coat pockets, staring toward the print shop as smoke drifted from nearby chimneys. Eventually, he crossed the street and knocked once before entering. Ghost allowed it. That told Ethan enough. Mercer removed his hat slowly. "You look like hell. Didn't sleep much." The sheriff's eyes landed almost immediately on the objects spread across the work table. The dog tags, the photographs, the journal. His expression changed instantly. "Where'd you get those?" Ethan studied him carefully. "Hidden compartment inside the type cabinet." Mercer stepped closer slowly, like a man approaching something dangerous. Then he picked up one of the photographs. Samuel Whitaker standing beside Nathan Cole outside the print shop in 1971. The sheriff exhaled softly through his nose. "I'll be damned. You know them?" "I knew Whitaker." Mercer's voice lowered slightly. "At least when I was a kid." Ethan leaned back against the press. Who was he really? The sheriff stayed quiet for several seconds. Outside, wind pushed loose snow through the empty street. Finally, Mercer spoke. "Samuel Whitaker ran Black Hollow Printing during the Vietnam years. Officially, he printed church bulletins and local newspapers. Unofficially?" The sheriff looked toward the front windows before answering. "Unofficially, people said he printed things the government didn't like." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Anti-war material? Among other things. Mercer picked up the journal carefully. There were rumors back then. Veterans coming through town late at night. Journalists. Activists. Men from Washington showing up asking questions. Ghost rose beside Ethan silently, alert again. Mercer noticed. "That dog really doesn't trust this situation." "Neither do I." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Smart instinct." Ethan crossed his arms. "My father worked with Whitaker." "Yes, you knew that." Mercer hesitated. "I knew Nathan Cole came here several times during the early 70s. He looked down at the journal again. But after Whitaker disappeared, people stopped talking about it. The word hit Ethan immediately. "Disappeared." Mercer looked up. "That's the story you got too, isn't it?" Cold spread slowly through Ethan's chest. "When?" "Winter of 72. Mercer's voice softened. "Whitaker vanished first. About 3 weeks later, your father disappeared too." The room went silent. Ghost pressed lightly against Ethan's leg, grounding him again. Mercer carefully opened the journal. Most pages contained coded notes and printing schedules. Then the sheriff stopped suddenly halfway through. His expression hardened. "What is it?" Mercer turned the journal slowly toward Ethan. A page filled with names. Military names, dates, coordinates, and one phrase underlined heavily in black ink. "Unreported casualties." Ethan stared at it. The sheriff's jaw tightened visibly. "I haven't seen these words in 50 years. You know what they mean?" Mercer looked suddenly much older. "When I got back from the Gulf," he said quietly, "I started helping veterans around town. PT cases, alcohol problems, suicides." His eyes drifted toward the snowy street outside. "One of the older vets used to come into my office every Memorial Day. Vietnam Marine. Drank too much, barely slept." Mercer swallowed slowly. "One year he told me some men never came home because officially they were never there." Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Mercer said carefully, Certain operations during Vietnam weren't supposed to exist. The lantern flame flickered softly between them. And if soldiers died during those missions, Ethan said slowly, there'd be no official record. Ghost let out a low sound deep in his chest. The sheriff looked toward the shepherd again. That dog senses tension before humans do, doesn't he? Usually. Mercer closed the journal carefully. You need to understand something, Ethan. His voice dropped lower now. If Whitaker was collecting evidence tied to covert military operations, this may be bigger than an old hidden drawer. Ethan stared at the photographs spread across the table. His father smiling beside the military dog, alive, present, real. So why hide all this here? Mercer hesitated. Because small-town print shops used to be invisible. He gestured around the room. Nobody paid attention to places like this. Outside, tires crunched through snow. All three of them looked toward the windows instantly. A black SUV rolled slowly past the building. Dark windows, out-of-state plates. Ghost moved immediately toward the door with a low growl. The SUV continued down Mercer Street without stopping. Still, the atmosphere inside the shop changed instantly. Mercer watched the vehicle disappear. You expecting visitors? No. The sheriff looked troubled now. Neither am I. After Mercer left, Ethan spent the afternoon reading the journal alone. Ghost never strayed more than a few feet from him. Page after page slowly revealed fragments of a hidden story. Whitaker had been investigating reports of missing American soldiers connected to covert missions near the Cambodian border during Vietnam. Nathan Cole helped print documents, photographs, eyewitness statements. Several pages described meetings with frightened veterans arriving secretly in Black Hollow after midnight, carrying evidence the government supposedly denied existed. Then Ethan found the final completed entry. December 3, 1971. Nathan believes publication will force congressional hearings. We argued tonight about risk. He wants to release everything immediately. I fear we are already being watched. The next page had been torn partially out. Ethan's pulse quickened. Only half the writing remained visible near the spine. If anything happens, tell my son. The truth matters more than. The sentence vanished where the page had been ripped away. Ethan stared at it for a very long time, then slowly closed the journal. Outside, evening settled across Black Hollow beneath bruised gray clouds. Ghost stood beside the front window again, watching the street, always watching now. Ethan walked slowly toward the massive press, standing silent in the center of the room. He rested one hand against the cold iron frame. All his life he had imagined his father weak, cowardly, selfish, gone. Now another possibility stood before him entirely. Maybe Nathan Cole had disappeared because he'd tried to expose something dangerous. Maybe he'd died trying. The thought broke something open inside Ethan that years of war had never fully touched. Not rage. Grief, real grief. The kind that arrives decades late and hits just as hard anyway. Ghost walked quietly to his side and leaned against him. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. You found him, didn't you? The shepherd looked up at him silently. Outside, snow began falling again over the dark mountain town, and somewhere beyond the frozen streets of Black Hollow, someone else now knew the hidden drawer had been opened. Ethan felt it before he could explain it, the same feeling he used to get overseas before ambushes. Not fear exactly, pressure, like the air itself had changed. Ghost sensed it too. The shepherd barely slept now. Every sound outside the print shop pulled his attention toward the windows. Every passing engine made his ears rise. 3 days after finding the hidden compartment, snow covered Black Hollow beneath a hard gray sky that looked heavy enough to collapse onto the mountains. Ethan spent the morning repairing cracked roller brackets on the old Chandler and Price press while the journal lay hidden beneath loose floorboards beside his blankets. He trusted nobody with it. Not yet, not even Sheriff Mercer. Ghost paced constantly between the front windows and the type cabinets, watching, protecting. By noon, Ethan finally managed to free the ink disc from years of rust. The massive metal plate groaned as it slowly rotated for the first time in decades. A strange satisfaction settled into his chest. Mechanical work still made sense. Machines either functioned or they didn't. No lies, no politics, no betrayal. Just pressure, timing, movement. He wiped grease from his hands when the front door opened suddenly. Clara Bennett stepped inside carrying a paper sack against her coat. But this time she looked frightened. Ghost stood instantly. "What happened?" Ethan asked. Clara glanced behind her before answering. "There was a man asking questions about you at the library." Ethan's expression hardened. "What kind of questions?" "He wanted to know how long you'd been staying here, whether you'd found anything inside the building." The room went still. Ghost moved closer beside Ethan's leg. "Did he give a name?" Clara shook her head. "No, but he wasn't local." She removed her gloves with nervous hands. "He said he represented historical preservation interests." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "But he didn't talk like somebody interested in history." Ethan already understood. "What he looked like?" "Tall, gray coat, military posture," Ghost growled softly. The sound vibrated low through the room. Clara looked toward the dog uneasily. "He scares me a little when he does that. He's warning us." The words settled heavily between them. Outside, wind pushed snow across Mercer Street in long white sheets. Clara lowered her voice. "Sheriff Mercer came by the library earlier too." "What'd he say?" "He told me not to discuss the print shop with strangers." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. That meant the sheriff was worried now too. Ghost suddenly moved toward the front windows. Alert. A black sedan rolled slowly past the building. Not Curtis Vale, different vehicle. Dark windows. No local plates. The car continued another 50 yards before stopping near the old pharmacy. Engine idling, watching. Clara noticed it too. "Oh God." Ethan stepped calmly toward the workbench and opened an old metal drawer. Inside rested the pistol. He kept wrapped beneath cleaning rags. Not because he wanted trouble, because old habits survived. Clara stared at him. "You think they know about the journal?" "I think somebody's been waiting a very long time for those papers to stay buried." The black sedan eventually drove away, but the pressure remained inside the room afterward. Ghost stayed near the front entrance for the rest of the afternoon, watching the street. As evening approached, snow began falling again. Heavy, wet, relentless. Black Hollow disappeared beneath it. The town diner closed early. Streetlights flickered through thick white darkness. By 8 o'clock, Mercer Street looked abandoned completely. Ethan secured the front door and fed Ghost from the last bag of dry food remaining in the truck. The shepherd ate quickly but remained restless afterward, pacing, listening. Ethan sat beside the old press, reading more of Whitaker's journal beneath lantern light. Several pages described secret meetings with veterans who claimed entire operations had been erased from official military records. Then Ethan found another line underlined heavily in black ink. "Nathan says, if the photographs become public, families will finally know what happened to their sons." Families, plural. Ethan rubbed both hands slowly across his face. How many people had spent decades waiting for answers? How many mothers had stared out windows like his own mother did? Ghost suddenly froze. Every muscle locked tight. Then came the sound. Footsteps. Outside. Slow, careful. Ethan extinguished the lantern instantly. Darkness swallowed the room. Ghost moved silently toward the rear hallway. Not barking, hunting. Ethan drew the pistol and listened carefully. Another footstep outside the front door. Then another. More than one person. The knob turned slowly, locked. A pause followed. Then, glass shattered near the back office. Ghost exploded forward instantly. The shepherd's bark ripped through the darkness like a gunshot. Ethan moved fast. Old instincts taking over completely. A flashlight beam cut through the rear hallway. Masked figures inside the building. Two of them, one heading toward the type cabinets, the other carrying a crowbar. Ghost hit the first intruder with terrifying force. The man crashed backward into a shelving unit as papers exploded into the air around them. The second intruder swung the crowbar wildly. Ethan tackled him hard into the old work table. Wood splintered, metal type scattered across the floor like hail. The man fought violently, trying to reach Ethan's pistol. Then Ghost screamed, not barked, screamed. Ethan spun instantly. The first intruder had driven a knife into Ghost's shoulder during the struggle. The shepherds still attacked anyway. Blood sprayed across the dusty floorboards while Ghost clamped onto the man's forearm with crushing force. The intruder yelled in panic, "Move! Move!" The second man slammed Ethan into the press, hard enough to blur his vision. Then both intruders fled toward the shattered rear window. Ghost lunged after them, despite the blood running down his leg. "Ghost, down!" The command stopped the shepherd instantly. Outside, tires screamed against snow. An engine roared away into the storm. Silence crashed down afterward. Heavy breathing. Wind through broken glass. Ghost collapsed near the cabinets. Ethan dropped beside him immediately. Oh God. Blood soaked through the shepherd's fur beneath his shoulder. Ghost tried to stand again anyway. Still working, still protecting. Easy, buddy. Easy. Ethan pressed both hands against the wound while panic hammered through his chest. Not again. Not another teammate. Not another partner, bleeding out in front of him. Afghanistan flashed violently through his mind. Travis Monroe choking on blood beneath desert sunlight. Medics screaming, helicopters, failure. Ethan shoved the memory away savagely. Not now. Ghost whined softly and licked Ethan's wrist. The dog was trying to calm him down, even injured, even bleeding. That broke something inside Ethan completely. He grabbed his coat and wrapped it tightly against the wound. "We're getting you help." The roads were nearly impassable. Snow buried the truck tires halfway before Ethan even managed to start the engine. Ghost lay across the passenger seat, trembling but alert, blood-soaking blankets beneath him. Ethan drove one-handed through whiteout conditions toward the sheriff's station, while holding pressure against the wound with the other. "Stay with me." Ghost's breathing came hard and uneven. The truck fishtailed twice on icy roads. Black Hollow appeared almost abandoned beneath the storm. Then finally, lights ahead. Sheriff Mercer burst through the station doors the moment Ethan arrived. "What happened?" "Break-in." Mercer saw the blood immediately. Jesus Christ. Together they carried Ghost inside. The sheriff shouted for emergency veterinary contacts, while Ethan knelt beside the shepherd on the station floor. Ghost's eyes never left Ethan's face. Still loyal, still trusting. Mercer returned moments later looking grim. "Retired vet lives 6 miles outside town. Iraq War K9 trainer. Can he help? He better." As the storm howled outside the station walls, Ethan sat beside Ghost with blood covering his hands. And for the first time since Afghanistan, he felt pure rage beginning to burn through the grief. Someone had come for the journal. Someone had stabbed his dog. And somewhere beneath the snow-covered darkness of Black Hollow, the war his father died fighting had just found Ethan too. The retired veterinarian lived alone at the edge of the mountains 6 miles outside town, in a narrow cedar cabin buried beneath pine trees and snowdrifts. His name was Walter Grady, 73 years old, former Army K9 trainer, Vietnam veteran. The moment Ethan carried Ghost through the cabin door, wrapped in blood-soaked blankets, Walter's face changed. Not surprise, recognition. "Military dog," the old man said immediately. "Yes," Walter pointed toward the kitchen table. "Lay him there." Ghost tried to stand again even while bleeding heavily. Still working. Still trying to protect Ethan. "Easy," Ethan whispered, pressing one hand gently against the shepherd's neck. "You did good." Ghost's tail moved once weakly. Walter cut through the fur, around the wound with steady, experienced hands, while Sheriff Mercer held a lantern close beside them. "Knifed, missed the lung," Walter muttered. "Lucky." Ethan stood rigid near the stove, with blood drying across his knuckles. The cabin smelled like antiseptic, wood smoke, and old coffee. Snow hammered softly against the windows while Walter stitched the wound carefully. Ghost never once snapped, never once cried out. The old vet glanced at Ethan while working. "He trusts you more than his own pain." Ethan swallowed hard but said nothing. Walter tied off the final stitch nearly an hour later and wrapped Ghost's shoulder tightly. "He'll live." The words nearly dropped Ethan to his knees. Instead, he leaned both hands against the counter and closed his eyes briefly. Not another teammate, not another partner. Walter cleaned blood from his hands slowly. "Military dogs don't quit easy." "No," Ethan said quietly. "They don't." Ghost finally slept beside the wood stove, wrapped in blankets while the storm deepened outside. Mercer poured coffee into chipped mugs and handed one to Ethan. "You know who came after you?" the sheriff asked. Ethan stared into the steam rising from the cup. "No, but they knew exactly where to look." "Yes." Walter glanced toward the sleeping dog. "And they were willing to stab a working animal to get it." Silence settled heavily across the cabin. Finally, Mercer spoke again. "Curtis Vale's been making calls." Ethan looked up. "What kind of calls?" "County offices, lawyers, insurance people." The sheriff's expression hardened, pushing hard to condemn the print shop immediately. "Why?" Mercer stared into his coffee. "Maybe because somebody suddenly wants that building empty." Walter snorted quietly. Nothing makes powerful men more nervous than old paper. The old K9 trainer crossed the room slowly and picked up one of the photographs Ethan had brought from the hidden drawer. Nathan Cole standing beside Samuel Whitaker outside the print shop in 1971. Walter's face went pale. "You know him," Ethan said carefully. Walter nodded once. "Your father came through here during the winter of '71. Ethan's pulse slowed instantly. "You met him?" "Twice." Walter lowered himself into a chair beside the stove. "Nathan brought a shepherd mix with him both times. Good dog." Ghost stirred faintly in his sleep. Walter stared at the old photograph. Whitaker was trying to expose something ugly back then. The missing soldiers. Walter's eyes lifted sharply. "So you found the journal." Ethan said nothing. Walter leaned back slowly. "Then you already know enough to be in danger." The cabin fell silent except for the storm outside. After a long moment, Walter spoke again. "There were rumors during Vietnam about unauthorized border missions. Men sent places the government officially denied entering." Mercer nodded grimly. "I heard versions of the same stories after Desert Storm." Walter looked toward Ethan. "Your father believed families deserved the truth." His weathered face tightened slightly. That belief cost him everything. The words landed heavily inside Ethan's chest. He looked toward Ghost sleeping beside the stove. The shepherd's chest rose and fell slowly beneath the blankets. Still here, still alive. Outside, dawn slowly approached beneath layers of a storm cloud. By morning, the roads back into Black Hollow were barely passable. Mercer insisted on driving Ethan and Ghost back himself. The sheriff's SUV crawled through deep snow while pine forests closed around the mountain roads like dark walls. Ghost lay across the back seat, heavily sedated but alert whenever Ethan spoke. As they approached town, Ethan saw smoke rising over Mercer Street. Too much smoke. His stomach tightened instantly. Mercer saw it too. Oh no, the SUV accelerated. Snow sprayed behind the tires while Black Hollow appeared through the storm ahead. People lined the street, fire trucks, flashing lights, voices shouting through the wind. And at the center of it, the print shop burned. Flames roared through shattered windows into the white morning sky, while black smoke rolled across rooftops and drifting snow. Ethan jumped from the SUV before it fully stopped. "No," Heat slammed into him as he pushed toward the fire line. The roof above the second floor had already collapsed inward. Burning paper spiraled into the storm like black birds, while water froze instantly along the sidewalks. Ghost struggled violently to stand in the back seat despite his injuries. The dog barked furiously for the first time since arriving in Black Hollow. Pure panic. Mercer grabbed Ethan's arm hard. "You can't go in there. The journal. Forget the damn journal." But Ethan was already moving. Seal instincts erased fear completely. Smoke, fire, chaos. His body understood emergencies before his mind did. He ripped free from Mercer's grip and disappeared through the side alley beside the building. The rear entrance still stood untouched by flames. Barely. Ethan kicked the door open and smoke swallowed him instantly. The interior glowed orange through rolling black haze. The old press stood at the center of the inferno, like some dying iron animal, while burning paper drifted across the room. Heat cracked the windows violently overhead. Ethan wrapped his sleeve across his mouth and forced himself forward. The floor groaned beneath his boots. Type drawers burned along the back wall. Metal letters spilled molten across the wood. He reached the loose floorboards near his blankets, just as part of the ceiling collapsed behind him. Flames exploded across the rear hallway. Ethan tore the journal free and shoved it beneath his coat. Then he stopped. The photograph. Nathan Cole's photograph still sat beside the press where Ethan had left it. For one impossible second, he stared at it through smoke and fire. Then he ran toward it. The heat became unbearable instantly. Burning beams cracked overhead. The old press glowed red along one side. Ethan grabbed the photograph, and the ceiling collapsed. The explosion of heat threw him hard against the machine. Pain ripped through his shoulder. Somewhere outside, people screamed his name. Then, suddenly, Ghost, the shepherd, had forced himself out of the SUV and into the alley, despite his fresh stitches. Ethan heard the barking through the roar of flames, sharp, desperate, calling him. The sound cut through everything. Ethan stumbled toward it blindly. The rear doorway appeared through smoke, just as another section of ceiling crashed behind him. Then cold air hit his face. Hands grabbed him outside. Mercer dragged him into the snow while firefighters surged past them toward the collapsing building. Ghost limped toward Ethan immediately, despite blood soaking through fresh bandages. The shepherd pressed against him hard, trembling violently. Ethan wrapped both arms around the dog. For several seconds, neither moved. Snow melted against Ethan's burned hands. The whole town watched the print shop burn. Clara stood across the street with tears frozen on her cheeks. Curtis Vale watched from beneath the awning of the pharmacy building. Too calm, too distant. Ethan noticed him instantly. Their eyes locked across the street through falling snow and orange firelight. Curtis gave the smallest shrug imaginable, as if old buildings burned every day, as if none of this mattered. Rage moved through Ethan like electricity. Not wild rage, cold rage. Controlled, dangerous. Mercer followed Ethan's gaze toward Curtis Vale. The sheriff's expression darkened immediately. "You stay away from him right now," Mercer warned quietly. Ethan said nothing. The roof collapsed fully moments later, with a shower of sparks that rose into the storm-dark sky. The sound echoed through Black Hollow like thunder. People slowly stepped backward from the heat. The old print shop groaned once more, then surrendered completely to fire. Ethan sat in the snow beside Ghost while flames consumed the only place he'd felt safe in years. The journal remained hidden beneath his coat, warm from the fire, heavy against his chest. Ghost rested his injured head against Ethan's leg while sirens echoed through the mountains. And somewhere inside the collapsing ruins of Black Hollow Printing, the past was burning alive all over again. The fire burned until nearly dawn. By sunrise, Mercer Street looked like the aftermath of a bombing. Steam rose from blackened rubble, while firefighters moved through the frozen wreckage, kicking apart smoking debris beneath weak morning light. Water dripped from shattered brick walls and froze instantly along the sidewalks. The print shop was gone, not damaged, gone. Only sections of the outer brick shell remained standing like broken teeth against the snowy sky. Ethan stood across the street beside Sheriff Mercer's SUV, with Ghost lying beneath heavy blankets in the back seat. The shepherd was awake now, weak, exhausted, still watching everything. Walter Grady's stitches had partially torn open during Ghost's attempt to follow Ethan into the burning building. Blood darkened the fresh bandages across the dog's shoulder. Even injured, Ghost kept his eyes fixed on the ruins, still guarding. Ethan hadn't spoken much since the fire. Smoke clung to his clothes and beard. Burns reddened both hands, where he'd grabbed the photograph near the collapsing press. But none of that hurt, as much as the emptiness sitting inside his chest while he stared at the destroyed building. Mercer handed him a paper cup of coffee. "You should get those burns looked at." Ethan ignored the cup. "Fire marshal say anything?" Mercer's jaw tightened. "Officially? Faulty wiring." Ethan looked at him slowly, and unofficially, the sheriff lowered his voice. "Accelerant near the rear office." Rage flickered quietly behind Ethan's eyes. Mercer glanced toward the ruins. Whoever did this wanted the building erased fast. Clara Bennett approached through the snow, carrying a wool blanket folded over one arm. Her eyes moved immediately to Ghost. "Oh, sweetheart." The shepherd recognized her scent and relaxed slightly for the first time since the attack. Clara knelt beside the SUV carefully and touched the dog's neck. "You brave old boy." Ghost rested his muzzle against her hand. That nearly broke Ethan more than the fire had, because Ghost trusted very few people. Clara looked up at Ethan quietly. "You saved the journal?" Ethan gave a small nod. Relief flashed across her face instantly. Then they failed, maybe, but Ethan wasn't certain anymore. Because standing there in the freezing morning light, staring at the smoking remains of the print shop, he suddenly understood something dangerous. The people behind this were not frightened amateurs. They were patient, connected, willing to destroy evidence permanently. The same kind of people Whitaker had feared 50 years earlier. And now Ethan had dragged Ghost directly into the middle of it. The thought sat heavily inside him all morning. By afternoon, the storm finally cleared. Sunlight broke through gray clouds and lit the mountains surrounding Black Hollow in cold silver light. Smoke continued drifting from the ruins while townspeople gathered quietly behind police tape. Some whispered, some stared openly at Ethan. Others simply looked sad. The old print shop had stood there longer than anyone alive in town. Even people who never entered it felt its absence now. Curtis Vale arrived around noon wearing a dark wool coat and polished boots that never touched the muddy snow. He stopped beside Mercer. "Terrible thing," Curtis said solemnly. Mercer's expression never changed. "Funny timing, though," Curtis sighed dramatically. "Old wiring. Old buildings." He glanced toward Ethan. That place was a death trap waiting to happen. Ethan stared at him silently. Curtis held the gaze for several seconds before smiling faintly. "You should be grateful you got out alive." Ghost growled immediately from inside the SUV. "Low. Dangerous." Curtis looked toward the dog. "That animal's getting aggressive." "He's smarter than most people," Ethan said quietly. The air between them tightened instantly. Curtis adjusted his gloves calmly. "Well," he said, "insurance investigators will probably shut the property down permanently now." Then he walked away. Mercer watched him go with narrowed eyes. "That man's been too calm since the fire started." "You believe he did it?" The sheriff looked toward the burned ruins. "I believe somebody wanted Whitaker's secrets buried permanently." His voice lowered. "And Curtis Vale's been trying very hard to make sure nobody digs around this property." Clara stepped closer beside Ethan. "What are you going to do now?" Ethan looked at the destroyed building. Truthfully, he didn't know. The print shop had become more than shelter somehow. It gave him structure, purpose, silence. Now it was ash, and Ghost was hurt because Ethan stayed. That guilt sat like concrete inside his chest. By evening, most of the crowds disappeared. Only smoke and wet black rubble remained. Mercer finally removed the police tape long after sunset. "Official investigation starts tomorrow," he said quietly. "You planning to leave town?" Ethan glanced toward Ghost sleeping uneasily in the SUV. Part of him wanted exactly that. Drive south, disappear again, forget all of it. But then he felt the journal hidden beneath his coat. Nathan Cole's photograph rested beside it, and suddenly leaving felt impossible. "No," Ethan said quietly. Mercer studied him carefully. "You sure?" "No." The sheriff almost smiled at that. Then he handed Ethan a ring of keys. "My cousin owns an empty hunting cabin outside town. You and Ghost can stay there a while." Ethan stared at the keys. "I can pay eventually." Mercer shook his head. "Just stay alive long enough to try." The hunting cabin sat beside a frozen creek 2 miles outside Black Hollow, surrounded by thick pine forest and snow-covered hills. Small, cold, quiet, perfect for hiding. Ghost settled slowly beside the wood stove, while Ethan unpacked what little survived the fire. The journal, the photograph, his blankets, a dented coffee pot. That was nearly everything left of his life now. Outside, moonlight reflected off deep snow while wind moved through the trees. Ethan sat alone at the small kitchen table, reading Whitaker's journal again. One final loose page slipped free near the back cover. Different paper, folded carefully. He opened it slowly. Inside was a handwritten note. "If this reaches someone willing to continue, the final printing plates remain beneath the foundation." Nathan wanted them hidden where fire could not touch them. Ethan sat perfectly still. Ghost lifted his head immediately. "What is it?" Clara asked softly from the doorway. Ethan hadn't heard her truck arrive. She stepped inside carrying groceries and firewood. Then she saw his face. "What happened?" Ethan handed her the note. Clara read it once, then again. "The foundation," she whispered. The realization settled between them heavily. Something else survived the fire. Ghost stood despite the pain in his shoulder. The shepherd limped toward the cabin door and stared out into the dark forest beyond the frozen creek, listening, watching. Ethan suddenly understood the attack, the fire, the pressure from Curtis Vale. None of it was over, because whatever Samuel Whitaker and Nathan Cole had hidden beneath Black Hollow printing 50 years earlier, someone still feared it enough to burn down an entire building. And now Ethan knew exactly where to look next. Outside, the winter wind moved softly through the mountains. And beneath the frozen ruins of the old print shop, the truth was still waiting. Ethan did not sleep that night. The hunting cabin remained dark, except for the glow of the wood stove and the lantern on the kitchen table, where Samuel Whitaker's journal lay open beside Nathan Cole's photograph. Outside, the Catskill Mountains disappeared beneath moonlit snow and black pine forest. Inside, Ghost slept uneasily near the fire. Every few minutes, the shepherd twitched in his dreams, paws jerking softly against the floorboards, as if still chasing the masked men through the burning print shop. Ethan watched him quietly. "You should stayed in the truck." Ghost opened one eye briefly, then closed it again. The dog would do the exact same thing tomorrow, if given the chance. That was the burden of loyalty. By dawn, Ethan had already made his decision. He was going back, not for revenge, for answers. The sky over Black Hollow turned pale gray as Ethan drove Sheriff Mercer's SUV slowly toward Mercer Street. Fresh snow covered most of the fire damage now, softening the destruction beneath a white blanket that almost looked peaceful from a distance. Almost. The moment Ethan stepped from the vehicle, the smell hit him again. Burned wood, wet ash, melted ink. Ghost limped beside him, despite Walter Grady's strict instructions to keep the shepherd resting. Stubborn old man, Ethan muttered. Ghost's tail moved once. The ruins of black hollow printing stood silent beneath the winter morning. Fire crews had removed most of the unstable debris overnight, leaving exposed sections of foundation and the skeletal remains of brick walls blackened by smoke. Clara waited near the sidewalk, wrapped in a long wool coat with a thermos tucked beneath one arm. "You're really doing this today?" "Yes." She handed him coffee. "You think the plates survived?" Ethan looked toward the collapsed center section where the old press once stood. Whitaker said they were hidden beneath the foundation. Clara stared at the ruins uneasily. "And if whoever burned the place down comes back," Ghost growled softly beside them. Ethan glanced toward the shepherd. "Then we'll know we found the right thing." Sheriff Mercer arrived an hour later with shovels and a portable generator mounted in the back of his SUV. The sheriff studied the burned building quietly. "I should probably stop you from digging around an active fire site. But you won't." Mercer gave a tired half-smile. "No." Together they climbed carefully through the ruins while snow drifted softly around them. The destruction looked worse up close. Collapsed beams, twisted metal, melted type blocks frozen into black puddles along the floor. The old Chandler and Price press had partially survived the fire. The massive cast-iron frame still stood in the center of the wreckage beneath layers of ash and ice, like the skeleton of some ancient machine refusing to die. Ethan stopped beside it. One side of the press remained scorched deep orange from the heat, but the flywheel still turned, barely. He rested one burned hand against the iron frame. "You made it too." Mercer looked around the ruins. "Where exactly did Whitaker say the plates were hidden?" Ethan unfolded the loose handwritten note carefully. "Beneath the foundation. Not helpful." Clara moved slowly through the wreckage, brushing ash from sections of exposed stone floor. Then Ghost stopped suddenly. The shepherd stood rigid beside the old press base, ears raised, watching Ethan again. Always the same look. Ethan moved beside him immediately. The concrete foundation beneath the press showed hairline cracks where firefighters had blasted the machine with freezing water all night. Ghost scratched once at the edge of the base. Mercer crouched nearby. "What is it, boy?" Ghost barked sharply. One bark, direct, intentional. Ethan grabbed a pry bar from the debris pile and jammed it carefully beneath the cracked section of concrete. The first slab shifted slightly, then cracked wider. Beneath it, metal. Mercer's eyes widened. "Son of A." Together they cleared away broken concrete and ash until a narrow steel compartment emerged, hidden beneath the press foundation itself. Waterproof, fireproof, deliberate. Ethan's pulse slowed automatically. Mission calm again. He pried the compartment open carefully. Inside rested 3 flat metal printing plates wrapped in oilcloth, and one sealed envelope. No money, no weapons, no valuables, just evidence. Whitaker had never been protecting wealth. He had been protecting truth. Ghost sat heavily beside the compartment as Ethan lifted the first plate carefully into the winter light. Etched words covered the metal surface backward for printing. Clara stared. "That's the article." Ethan turned the plate slightly. Even reversed, he could read fragments now. Unauthorized operations, missing Marines, suppressed casualty reports. Mercer removed his gloves slowly. "My God." The sheriff looked genuinely shaken. Ethan opened the envelope next. Inside waited one final handwritten letter. Addressed simply, "To whoever finishes this." His throat tightened instantly. He unfolded the pages carefully. "If you are reading this, then either Nathan or I failed to stop what was already beginning. The photographs prove American soldiers were abandoned during covert operations the government denied existed. The official casualty records were altered afterward. Families were told their sons died elsewhere, or never informed at all. Nathan believed the truth belonged to the families, even if it destroyed powerful men. If these plates survive, print them. Not for politics, not for revenge. Print them because forgotten men deserve to be remembered correctly. Samuel Whitaker, January 1972. Silence settled across the ruins. Even the wind seemed quieter suddenly. Ethan stared at the final line for a very long time. Forgotten men deserve to be remembered correctly. The sentence struck him harder than anything else in the journal, because he understood forgotten men. He had become one himself. Ghost rested gently against Ethan's leg, grounding him again, always grounding him. Mercer finally spoke. "You realize if this gets published," he glanced around carefully, "there are people who'll do anything to stop it." "They already tried." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Yes." Clara looked toward Ethan. "So what now?" Ethan stared down at the printing plates. The answer arrived quietly. Simple, certain. "Now we print it." The words surprised even him, because, for the first time since Afghanistan, Ethan heard conviction in his own voice again. Not survival, purpose. That afternoon, they moved the surviving Chandler and Price press into an abandoned maintenance garage behind Sheriff Mercer's station. The machine weighed nearly 2 tons. It took chains, a borrowed forklift, and 4 exhausted volunteers from town to move it through icy streets. People gathered silently to watch. The homeless veteran, the injured military dog, the burned print shop, the ancient press being rescued from ashes. Black Hollow had started paying attention now. By evening, the press stood inside the garage beneath hanging worklights, scarred, blackened, still standing. Ghost lay nearby wrapped in blankets while Ethan cleaned ash carefully from the machine gears. Clara sorted surviving type blocks into wooden trays. Mercer locked the garage doors himself. Snow fell outside while the old press slowly came back to life beneath Ethan's hands. One gear at a time, one bolt at a time. The rhythm steadied him, focused him. Walter Grady arrived after dark, carrying fresh bandages for Ghost. The old K-9 trainer watched Ethan work for a long moment before speaking. "You look different." Ethan didn't glance up. How? Like a man who stopped drifting. The garage fell quiet, because everyone there understood it was true. Near midnight, Ethan finally mounted Whitaker's first printing plate onto the restored press bed. The metal clicked softly into place. Ghost lifted his head, watching. Ethan rolled fresh black ink across the cylinders carefully. The smell filled the garage immediately. Ink, oil, warm machinery, the smell of the old world. The smell his father carried home on his hands. His chest tightened unexpectedly. For one impossible second, Ethan could almost hear Nathan Cole beside him again. Steady voice, grease-stained fingers, patient eyes, read the shape of the words, "son." Ethan fed a blank sheet slowly into the press. Then he pulled the lever. The machine groaned heavily. The rollers turned. The plate pressed down against paper for the first time in more than 50 years. When Ethan lifted the sheet free, the truth stared back at him in sharp black letters. Real now. Permanent. Printed. Ghost stood slowly despite the pain in his shoulder and walked to Ethan's side. The old shepherd looked down at the fresh page as if he understood exactly what it meant. Maybe he did, because without Ghost, none of this would have been found at all. Outside, snow fell silently across Black Hollow. And inside the warm garage behind the sheriff's station, the dead were finally beginning to speak again. The first copies came off the press just after midnight. The old Chandler and Price groaned and shuddered beneath the hanging work lights, while fresh, black ink pressed words into thick cream paper, one page at a time. Heavy, deliberate, permanent. Ethan stood at the machine feeding sheets carefully into the rollers, while Ghost rested nearby on folded blankets beside the heater. The shepherd refused to sleep completely. Even exhausted and injured, Ghost kept lifting his head toward the garage windows every time tires passed outside. Still guarding, always guarding. Clara stacked the finished pages carefully along the workbench, while Sheriff Mercer read each line with growing disbelief. The article was devastating. Detailed witness statements, suppressed casualty reports, photographs proving unauthorized border missions officially denied by military leadership during Vietnam. And at the center of everything, names real men, young Marines and Army Rangers listed as missing under circumstances their families had never been told about truthfully. Walter Grady sat silently near the back wall, staring at the pages as they accumulated. Finally he spoke. "I knew 2 of these boys." The garage went still. Walter pointed toward one printed paragraph with trembling fingers. Tommy Bales, 19 years old, from Syracuse. His voice roughened slightly. His mother spent 20 years writing letters to Washington. Mercer lowered the page slowly. What they tell her? Walter gave a bitter laugh. That her son died during routine combat operations. He shook his head. But Tommy told me himself before deployment they were crossing borders unofficially. Silence settled heavily over the garage. The old press continued turning steadily behind Ethan. Ka-thunk, 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 like a heartbeat, like history refusing to stay buried. By dawn, they had printed nearly 200 copies, enough for every home in Black Hollow, enough to make the truth impossible to erase again. Clara stood near the workbench, photographing pages with her phone. "You're posting them online?" Ethan asked. "Yes, that could get dangerous." Clara looked up at him calmly. "It already is." Ghost limped slowly toward Ethan and rested against his leg while the press continued running. Ethan scratched gently behind the shepherd's ears. "You started all this, didn't you?" Ghost looked up at him quietly. The answer was yes. Without the dog, the hidden drawer stayed closed. The journal burned. The dead stayed forgotten. By mid-morning, Black Hollow began reading. The diner, the hardware store, church basements, kitchen tables. People passed the printed pages hand to hand beneath the gray winter sky, while snow drifted quietly through town. And reaction spread quickly. Shock, anger, grief, especially among older residents who remembered Vietnam too well. Phones rang constantly at Sheriff Mercer's station. Veterans from neighboring counties began calling after seeing Clara's photographs online. Then came the first visitor. A silver pickup rolled slowly into the station parking lot around noon. An older man climbed out carrying a folded newspaper clipping inside trembling hands. Marine Corps jacket, white beard, cane. He walked directly into the garage where Ethan stood cleaning the press. "My brother's name is on that paper." The room fell silent. The man unfolded the clipping carefully. A photograph of a smiling 19-year-old soldier. "James Rourke missing in action, 1971. They told my mother he died in Laos," the man whispered. "Your article says his unit was never supposed to be there." Ethan looked at the printed pages beside the press. That's what Whitaker uncovered. The older man stared at Nathan Cole's photograph sitting near the workbench. "Your father helped print this?" "Yes." The man's eyes filled slowly. Then he crossed the room and shook Ethan's hand with both of his. "For 50 years, he said quietly, my mother died believing nobody cared what happened to Jimmy." Ghost moved closer silently and rested his head against the man's coat. The older veteran broke completely then. Tears finally came, not loud, not dramatic, just decades of grief finally loosening all at once inside a freezing garage behind a sheriff's station in a forgotten mountain town. By evening, more veterans arrived. Some drove hours through snow after seeing Clara's online posts. Others brought old photographs, letters, military records. One woman carried a folded American flag, still sealed in plastic from her father's funeral. Another brought a box of unopened telegrams. Her grandmother refused to throw away after losing 2 sons in Vietnam. The garage became something unexpected. Not a newsroom, a reckoning. Ghost moved quietly among them all despite his injuries. The shepherd seemed to understand exactly who these people were. Men carrying invisible weight. Families built around unanswered grief. He rested beside shaking hands, leaned against crying veterans. sat silently near widows who stared at the printed pages without speaking. Walter Grady watched the dog carefully. He's working again. Ethan glanced toward Ghost. The old shepherd stood beside a veteran in a wheelchair whose hands would not stop trembling. Patient, calm, protective. Yes, Ethan said softly, he was. Late that night, Sheriff Mercer entered the garage, carrying a stack of papers and a grim expression. Federal investigators called. The room quieted immediately. Mercer placed the documents on the table. They're reopening several classified casualty reviews connected to Whitaker's evidence. Clara exhaled sharply. So it's real. Oh, it's real. Mercer looked toward Ethan. And somebody very powerful is suddenly nervous. Curtis Vale? The sheriff nodded slowly. We traced ownership records this afternoon. His jaw tightened. Curtis's investment company received funding years ago from a defense contracting firm tied to retired military intelligence operations. Walter muttered softly under his breath. There it is, Mercer continued. 2 investigators from Albany are already driving here tonight. Outside, snow began falling again. Soft, quiet, endless. Ethan looked around the garage. At the veterans reading Whitaker's article beneath work lights. At Clara organizing printed copies. At Walter helping Ghost settle back onto the blankets. At the old press standing alive again after surviving fire and silence and 50 years of dust. The drifting, homeless veteran who bought a condemned building for $1 suddenly understood something enormous. He was no longer alone. The realization hit him harder than combat ever had, because loneliness becomes addictive after enough years. Men like Ethan learned to survive by expecting nothing from anyone. Now suddenly, people were showing up, helping, listening, staying. The feeling terrified him, almost as much as it healed him. Near midnight, Ethan finally drove alone to the cemetery outside Black Hollow, carrying Nathan Cole's photograph beneath his coat. Snow covered the gravestones in soft white hills beneath bare winter trees. Ghost limped beside him through the darkness. Mercer had located the grave only hours earlier. Unmarked county burial, 1972 John Doe until now. Ethan found the stone beneath fresh snow near the tree line. Small, simple. Nathan Cole, 1940-1972, that was all. No military honors, no explanation, no family. Just a name finally restored. Ethan stood there a very long time while snow settled across his coat and shoulders. Ghost sat beside the grave silently, watching him. Finally, Ethan crouched slowly and brushed snow from the stone with burned hands. You should come home. His voice cracked unexpectedly. Not from anger anymore. Grief. Real grief. The kind that arrives decades too late and still cuts clean through the ribs anyway. I spent half my life hating you. Wind moved softly through the cemetery trees. Ghost pressed gently against Ethan's shoulder, grounding him again. Always grounding him. Ethan stared down at the grave, then slowly placed Whitaker's first printed article beneath the snow-covered stone. The truth his father died trying to print. Finished now. Complete. You were right, Ethan whispered. Forgotten men deserve to be remembered correctly. Behind him, Black Hollow glowed softly beneath falling snow. And for the first time since Afghanistan, Ethan Cole no longer felt like a ghost himself. Winter passed slowly in Black Hollow. Snowstorms came and went across the Catskills, while frozen rivers cracked beneath warming sunlight and smoke continued, rising from chimneys along Mercer Street every evening, like the town itself was breathing again after a long illness. The ruins of Black Hollow printing remained untouched until spring, not abandoned, protected. People left flowers there sometimes, veterans especially. Small American flags began appearing along the melted sidewalk beside the burned foundation where the old press had once stood. Nobody removed them. Federal investigators arrived twice during February, then again in March. Questions spread outward for Whitaker's article. into old military archives and sealed casualty reports that had not been opened in decades. Several names from the printing plates matched veterans officially listed under contradictory circumstances. Congressional offices became involved quietly, then loudly. Television reporters called Sheriff Mercer almost daily. Curtis Vale stopped appearing in public. By April, federal fraud investigators froze several of his business accounts connected to old defense contracting investments. Nobody in Black Hollow seemed surprised. Man always acted like he owned everybody. Martha, from the diner, said one morning while pouring coffee for a table full of retired mill workers. Now people looked at Ethan differently too. Not with suspicion anymore. Respect. The shift happened gradually. A nod at the hardware store. Free coffee at the diner. A waitress refusing payment for Ghost's bacon scraps every morning. The homeless drifter who bought the condemned print shop for $1 had somehow become part of the town itself. Ethan still didn't fully trust that feeling. Some wounds healed slowly, but he no longer parked near exits automatically. He no longer woke every night reaching for rifles that weren't there. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, he slept through dawn without nightmares. Ghost healed too. The shepherd carried a permanent limp afterward, especially during cold mornings. But Walter Grady declared him stubborn enough to live another 10 years out of pure refusal to quit. Dogs running entirely on attitude now, the old canine trainer joked. Ghost accepted the attention with quiet dignity. The shepherd spent most days beside the rebuilt press inside the new workshop the town helped Ethan create. Not a large building, just an old brick maintenance garage, renovated slowly through volunteer labor and donated supplies. But it worked. The Chandler and Price press stood near the center, beneath warm, hanging lights, surrounded by shelves of rescued-type drawers and rebuilt work tables. The smell returned first, ink, paper, machine oil, then the sound, ka-thunk, 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 the heartbeat of printing. People visited constantly, veterans mostly. Some brought photographs. Others brought stories. A Marine from Albany carried letters his brother wrote before disappearing during Vietnam in 1971. A widow from Syracuse delivered her husband's old combat journal wrapped carefully in cloth. Teenagers from the local school came after classes just to watch Ethan set type by hand. He taught them slowly, patiently, read the shape of the words, exactly the way Nathan Cole once taught him. The strange thing was, Ethan discovered he liked teaching. Not because he enjoyed talking. He still preferred silence most days. But watching people learn something real with their hands calmed him in ways therapy never managed. The work mattered. That made all the difference. One cold October evening, exactly 1 year after the fire, the first edition of the rebuilt Black Hollow Gazette rolled off the press. 8 pages, local stories, obituaries, veteran memorials, community notices, printed by hand. Every copy sold out before sunset. Clara Bennett framed the first edition and hung it near the workshop entrance, beside a black and white photograph of Samuel Whitaker and Nathan Cole standing outside the original print shop in 1971. Below it, she placed a small brass plaque. "The truth was worth printing." Ethan protested the plaque at first, then eventually stopped mentioning it, because secretly, he liked seeing his father remembered properly. Ghost slept beneath that photograph most afternoons, always near the press, always near Ethan. The old shepherd moved slower now. Gray had spread around his muzzle and eyes. But every morning he still completed a careful perimeter walk around the workshop before settling onto his blanket beside the machine. Working dog habits never disappeared completely. Neither did Ethan's. One evening near Christmas, heavy snow returned to the mountains. Large flakes drifted through the streets of Black Hollow, while holiday lights glowed warmly across storefront windows, and church bells echoed through the valley. Ethan stayed late, finishing memorial cards for a military funeral in Kingston. The workshop felt warm against the storm outside. Ink rollers turned softly. Type clicked against metal trays. Ghost snored lightly near the heater. Peace, real peace. The front door suddenly opened hard enough for wind and snow to swirl inside. A teenage boy stood in the doorway, trembling violently beneath a soaked hoodie. 16 maybe, thin, terrified. Ghost lifted his head immediately. The boy froze at the sight of the shepherd. "I'm sorry," he stammered quickly. "I didn't mean to." Then his voice broke. Ethan recognized that look instantly. The look of somebody with nowhere left to go. The boy's backpack hung half open beside him with clothes shoved carelessly inside. "Runaway." Ghost stood slowly despite his aching leg and walked toward the teenager. No growling, no alarm. The shepherd simply stopped beside him quietly. The boy's hands shook harder. Then, unexpectedly, Ghost leaned gently against him. The kid collapsed into tears instantly. Not loud, just exhausted. The kind of crying people do when they finally reach someplace safe enough to stop pretending they're okay. Ethan looked away politely and gave the boy time. Snow blew softly through the open doorway behind them. Finally, Ethan crossed the room and closed the door against the storm. "What's your name?" "Lucas." "You hungry?" The boy nodded without lifting his face. Ethan pointed toward the small kitchen area near the back wall. "There's soup on the stove." Lucas hesitated. Ghost stayed pressed quietly against his side. "It's all right," Ethan said softly. "He already decided you're okay." The teenager managed the faintest broken smile. While Lucas ate soup beside the heater, Ethan returned to the press. The machine turned steadily beneath warm light. Ka-thunk, ka-thunk, ka-thunk. Ghost eventually limped back toward Ethan and settled beside the old press with a heavy sigh. The shepherd looked tired, content, home. Ethan reached toward the shelf above the workbench and picked up an old wooden composing stick, worn smooth by decades of use. Nathan Cole's. He walked over and placed it gently into Lucas' trembling hands. The boy looked confused. "What is this?" Ethan leaned against the work table quietly while snow fell outside the glowing workshop windows. "First thing you learn in printing," he said softly, "is how to read backward before the world makes sense forward." Lucas looked down at the worn wood carefully. Ghost rested his head across Ethan's boot. The old press continued, turning steadily beside them. Outside, snow covered Black Hollow beneath soft winter light. Inside the workshop, warmth filled the room. Ink, paper, steam rising from soup bowls. The quiet breathing of an old military dog beside the machine he helped save. And for the first time in decades, Ethan Cole was no longer homeless. He had a town, a purpose, a name people spoke with respect. And beside him, exactly where he had always belonged, Ghost finally rested. If this story meant something to you, type truth down in the comments. And if you've ever had a dog, a friend, or a family member who stayed loyal when the world turned cold, let us know where you're watching from tonight. Around here, we believe forgotten people still deserve dignity, and the truth is always worth fighting for. Subscribe if you want more stories about courage, loyalty, and ordinary Americans standing their ground when it matters most.